Now let's go to Psalm 93 and talk about our majestic King together. Psalm 93, I know many of you look at where we're going to be and read the psalm. Much briefer one this evening. And let's read Psalm 93, and then I'm going to go back to an Old Testament text, or a different Old Testament text. Psalm 93. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He has put on strength as his belt. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. Your throne is established from old. You are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring, mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. Your decrees are very trustworthy. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore. This psalm is brief, but it is comprehensive in its theology, and it comprehensively unpacks for us one primary aspect of the person of God. And this primary aspect, this primary theology, is not only one of God's attributes, but it is a foundational attribute of God, in that his other attributes operate out of, you could say, by an extension of this attribute. And it is the attribute that is, interestingly enough, most fully explained for us, or maybe most comprehensively explained for us, by a pagan king after a very weird story. And this pagan king reigned and ruled one of, even to this day, the most majestic and wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms of all time. At the time that Babylon was at its peak, there wasn't a kingdom like it in its philosophical and intellectual development, its resource, its military might. And you know this king is Nebuchadnezzar, walking out in a terrace of his palace, looking around at his kingdom, admiring himself, admiring what he thought he had done in his own strength and in his own wisdom, and believing himself essentially to be God. And in one of the forgotten weird stories of the Old Testament, there's some weird stories, weird true stories in the Old Testament, but this is one of the weird forgotten ones, where Nebuchadnezzar, in his arrogance, is turned into a walking animal. God says, watch this. And he snaps his fingers, as it were, and he grows claws, and he develops feathers, and he eats from the ground. This is Daniel chapter 4, verse 33. And immediately the word was fulfilled. This was the word as a judgment against Nebuchadnezzar. And he was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as eagle's feathers and his nails were like bird's claws. And we don't know when, we don't know how, but at some point, sense returns to Nebuchadnezzar. And at the end of my days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, this is verse 34, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed thee, listen, most high. It's significant that Nebuchadnezzar refers to Yahweh this way. There's no king like him. Why is it significant that he acknowledges God as most high? And And it's significant because this is what I mean, that Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan king that God turns into a beast, whether or not it's a true Old Testament conversion or just a temporary submission, and we don't know from Nebuchadnezzar, but it is perhaps the single most profound, comprehensive one passage on God's sovereignty in all of the Bible. This is what he says. I love this text. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand and say to him, what have you done? Or some translations make it the present, what are you doing? And God in his grace restores Nebuchadnezzar to his kingdom. And it is that theology that we get to study this evening. That theology that Nebuchadnezzar learned so painfully, the theology of God's sovereignty. Psalm 93 introduces a string of psalms that are going to focus on this aspect of God, that he is sovereign over all. All of the psalms from here, actually starting from 93 and then 94 doesn't, but from 94 up to Psalm 99, all of them quote the phrase, God reigns, drawing our attention to the universal, sovereign rule of our God. It is a powerful theology. It's a complex theology in some ways. And it's one that I think in our struggle and in our difficulty, we get wrong, and we really need to endeavor to get right as much as possible. So let's pray, and we'll begin to study God's sovereignty from Psalm 93 together. God, we're thankful that you rule, that the Lord reigns. I mean, truly, if you don't reign, what are we even doing? Our life is out of control. But we thank you for the certainty that is in these three simple words, that the Lord reigns. I pray that you would encourage your people with this truth tonight. We ask through Christ. Amen. We automatically have to place ourselves in a category of something that we've talked about even throughout the Psalms, of kingship, we have to think about monarchs, we have to think about reigning a throne. But even as we do this, we have to think about it differently than how you and I tend to think of monarchs, because, if you think about human history, and we see this in Israel, but Israel's just Israel's history in this regard is a microcosm of human history. Most kings aren't good. Most kings have failed in some way. All kings have failed in some way, but most kings have massive failures. So when we think about what sovereignty is and who God is as our king, Psalm 93 is helpful because it gives us theological categories to think about what it means that God reigns, but it also presents God in a specific way that we really do want God to reign. Not just that he does reign, but that we really, truly need and want this God as our sovereign. Let's start in verses 1 and 2 and focus on his eternal reign. His eternal reign. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He has put on strength as his belt. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. Your throne is established from old, and you are from everlasting. Three very simple ideas about the reign of God in these verses. One is that he is an impressive king. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. This word majesty has the idea of glory or beauty. So when we think about God as our king, he is a beautiful king. He is an awesome God. Not only do we want God to reign for his authoritative and powerful abilities, the psalmist is drawing us into the idea that when we get a glimpse of who God is as much as we can, and we understand who God is, we're overwhelmed by it. If you think about the idea of impressive kings in the Old Testament, you understand that Israel wanted a king that impressed them physically. We've talked about this recently. I don't remember in what message, but do you remember David's dad was surprised that it wasn't Eliab? Why? Because he was bigger than all the others. What was one of the most significant standout features about Saul? His shoulders stood above everybody. He was a big man. And so we even understand that within Jewish history, they thought about impressiveness as important for the king. It's not very different than how we view human leaders today. It's not. There is a reason parties try to run people that are objectively attractive. Am I wrong? We just tend to trust people that we think are impressive looking. And maybe we shouldn't, but we do. And so on the human level, the psalmist is saying he's beautiful, he's a majestic king, but on an eternal spiritual level, the beauty of God is outside our categories of objective beauty. He is robed in majesty. We are to picture a God who is impressive. He is powerful. The Lord is robed. He has put on strength as his belt. In other words, it's the idea that he's wearing power. So again, the psalmist is using physical imagery for us here. We are to picture in our mind, we're to have a king in our mind that we want to follow, that we want to reign over us. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. But this is where the psalmist moves from just the idea of impressiveness and power and strength to a scope that is outside of Saul's impressiveness and outside of David's impressiveness. The scriptures even acknowledge that David was a handsome man. So the scope is now not just a kingdom where he reigns in a palace and he has subjects and he commands an army, but the throne is established from old. It's an eternal throne. It's an everlasting throne. It's a heavenly throne. What sets God apart in his majesty? It is his spiritual beauty that is too much for us to behold. And you think about Moses here in Exodus 33. God, I just want to see you. And in our vernacular, God says, no, you don't. You can't handle that. So I'm gonna tuck you away so that it's safe for you. And in his infinite power, God can do whatever he wills. And in his timeless throne. This is obviously a distinguisher between the reign of God and the reign of all people. We just recently in our world experienced the end of the second longest reign in human history. And of course, you know that I am talking about Queen Elizabeth, who reigned as an individual for 70 years. The longest human reign is Louis XVIII of France, who reigned for 72 years. You say, well, that's not very long at all. No, it's not. Well, what about dynasties throughout human history? The house of the Dulo or Dulo clan reigned from 2137 BC until 753 in what is now known as Bulgaria. The Imperial House of Japan has been ruling the country from 660 BC until today. The throne of the Yamamoto dynasty almost 2,700 years. But the reason I bring this out is because we have very specific timestamps on these human reigns. And even these dynasties aren't one individual, it's just their families. We don't have a category for this in the U.S. because we put terms on everything. Well, we should put terms on everything. We put terms in the White House. Sorry, I was accidentally political. But this is not an everlasting kingdom. The vision of God, the Most High, on the throne, often attributed with His eternality, that His reign is everlasting, is pervasive in the Bible. 1 Kings 22, Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1, Daniel 7, Revelation 4, Psalm 11, Psalm 45, Psalm 47, Hebrews 12, Revelation 3. The Most High reigns forever. So what sets Him apart? You want to follow Him because He is infinite in majesty. When you see Him, you're struck by Him as much as you can, because again, we can't see Him. But when you glimpse His power and you experience His power, you begin to trust Him, so you want to follow Him. And when you recognize that He has reigned and He will always reign, and His reign has always been right, and it will always be right, you want to be in His kingdom. Because He reigns. He expresses His power in His reign. We acknowledge His majesty as our sovereign. But it's not just us. We as the subjects of His kingdom, so to speak, it's not just us who acknowledge His majesty. It's not just us who acknowledge His authority, His sovereign rule. Nature acknowledges His sovereign rule. Verse 3, the floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. Mightier than the thunders of many waters. Mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. So first of all, His eternal reign. Second of all, the earthly rejoicing. The earthly rejoicing. What king of man has a choir of water singing His praises? What ruler of the earth has had rocks cry out His praise? The floods have lifted up, almost like as water rises, so the sound of the water rising brings praise before the King. Mightier than the thunders of many waters. Many of you have been to Niagara Falls and you've heard the massive crashing. And you hear the power of God. And that massive crashing, as those, I don't know how many gallons of water, crash into the river, it brings praise to the sovereign Lord. And when you go to the sea, and you pick up a shell, and you hold it to your ear, and you hear the ocean, creation sings the Father's song. The God who created by all things, because of His divine superintending reign, He does all things that He wants to do, and He can do what He wants to do. Who spoke creation, who sustains creation. The God whom the oceans lift up their voice, the waters lift up their praise, loves you. The God that you want to be your king wants to call you son and daughter. So the sovereignty of God, while foundational to understanding who God is, and while massive in its cosmological implications, its theological implications, is deeply personal to your growth and security as a Christian. So the sovereignty of God in His universal reign, the sovereignty of God in His creative reign, that He made all and He rules all that He has made, and He sustains all that He rules. This is what Kuyper means when he famously says, "There is not one square inch over God's creation over which He does not cry, 'Mine, and I rule it.'" But the psalmist takes the sovereignty of God and brings it down to our presence and our living, from the chorus of rushing waters to the word and presence of God. Verse 5, we'll look together at His everlasting rightness. Rightness. Notice I didn't just say righteousness. I mean that which is pure and right about God. Your decrees are very trustworthy. What a simple and needed verse for us. Your decrees are very trustworthy. You can trust God's word. Why? Because He is who He is, and He is sovereign. He reigns all, and what He says is enough. Holiness befits your house, O Lord, forevermore. Your decrees are very trustworthy. Holiness befits your house. You can trust the Word of God, and you must experience the presence of God in His house because He is who He is, and He is a right, holy God, and it characterizes His presence. And it not only characterizes His presence, but because He is who He is, it characterizes the place of worship. How long? Forevermore. And in what is the forevermore rooted? It's rooted in the eternality of God, which has already been established in His sovereign rule forever. In the second part of verse 1 and 2, the world is established, it shall never be moved. Your throne is established from old, and you are everlasting. J.I. Packer summarizes Psalm 93 in his book, Concise Theology, which, by the way, if you ever want a book to really help you with concise theology, I recommend Concise Theology by J.I. Packer. He says of Psalm 93, in his description of God's sovereignty, Psalm 93 guarantees the stability of the world against all forces of chaos. It confirms the trustworthiness of God and all God's utterances and directives, and it calls for homage and holiness on the part of His people. All of these things rightly recognizing God's sovereign rule. I said at the beginning, I think it's a theology that we say that we know. I know God's in charge. I know God reigns everything. But I think in many ways we accidentally get it wrong. And I think we get it wrong in some complex theological ways, but I think more than that, I think we get it wrong practically in some of how we believe about our life. And tonight, just by way of application, I want to share 3 what I'm calling holes in our sovereignty. I only have 3. I'm sure there's more. And maybe these are my holes and they're not yours. But 3 holes in our view of God's sovereignty. Largely, these have come out of counseling situations and how I understand human nature and what we see in the Scriptures, and much of how I've seen in my own life and desire that God would change. So, by way of application, 3 holes in our sovereignty. I don't have these on the screen, but if you'd like to take notes, I've tried to essentially make them points. Hole number 1 in our view of God's sovereignty. Lacking intervention is lacking activity. Lacking intervention is the same thing as lacking activity. In other words, we think in a difficult situation, since God is not intervening, He is not sovereignly active in this situation. Because what we think is if God was sovereignly reigning over every situation, especially the ones that were bad, He would be more active in it. And He would intervene by doing X, Y, and Z. But I think if we understand that God's superintending of all things, that He does what He wants to do for the reasons that He has in mind, that He's ordained from the beginning of time, and He can do what He wills, does not mean that just because I am in a situation that is difficult, and He is not intervening in such a way, He is not sovereignly active in that situation. God made, and then He rested, and allowed what He created to function the way that He created it, because in His infinite wisdom, He created it to function. Therefore, He ceased creation. Elijah in 1 Kings 19, he's in the most fearful time of his life. He's just seen God do something astounding, bring down fire from heaven, which is what he wanted. And then Jezebel threatens him, and he runs for his life. And he says things like, I'm no better than my fathers, just take my life. He's focused on himself. And we think, right along with Elijah, that what God needs to do is intervene in some massive way. And if He's not intervening in some massive way, then He's not sovereignly active in this. And so this is exactly what God teaches Elijah in that beautiful Hebrew passage. God sent an earthquake, but He was not in the earthquake. And you understand that God is omnipresent. So actually He was, but the writer wants to point out that that's not how God chose to reveal Himself. So He sent a wind and He wasn't in the wind. So He sent a fire and He wasn't in the fire. God, why don't you intervene? But He had been. Elijah had food and water for weeks. And He told him to rest. And then He spoke to him in silence, a still small voice. Psalm 121:4, the God, the keeper of Israel, will not slumber or sleep. God is not sleeping in your suffering. But the hole in our sovereignty is that we think, in our view of God's sovereignty, is that we think lacking intervention is the same thing as lacking activity. Because we have defined intervention and we have defined the right activity. But God has sovereignly intended it. And He is working His will the way that He has always intended it. The second hole in our sovereignty is that God works in tandem with my will. God works in tandem with my will. God does what I want Him to do, or at least He adjusts around what I want Him to do. And there's this fascinating verse in Acts chapter 2 when Peter is preaching, and it's not, you wouldn't necessarily think it's a passage on the sovereignty of God, but in Acts chapter 22, this is what, Acts chapter 2, verse 23, this is what Peter says about Jesus and the plan of God concerning Christ. according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, God's sovereignty. You killed him. Did you catch that? Peter's speaking to the Jews about Jesus according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. You killed him. So who does God's will? We do. Psalm 135:6. Whatever the Lord pleases, He does. In heaven and on earth and in the seas and in the deeps. Now this one's hard for us, isn't it? Because what do we want God to do? What we want God to do. Which means we have to take a step back. We have to ask ourselves the question, what do I believe about God's will versus what do I believe about my will? Because if I believe my will is best, I will impose that upon Him. And I will expect that from Him. But if I have the Spirit of Christ, even at the most difficult time in my life, sweating drops of blood that says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then I have set myself up by God's grace and for His glory to understand that what He does, what He pleases, what pleases Him, He does. And ultimately what He does is what I need. I think one of the most difficult things about God's sovereignty is that it forces us to really find out if we trust Him or not. Is that it really brings us to the point of whether we're going to exercise our faith or just talk about it. That if we want a God, the God who is, or the God that we want. Because He reigns, I don't. And that means there are going to be times when He reveals something by His purposes and for His plans and for His glory and my sanctification and my growth that I don't like. I can't give names yet. I don't think the family's talking about it yet. It's not someone in our church, but we got news today. A friend of mine, friend of my wife's family, we worked with her at camp. She's 30, maybe 31, so just a few years older than us. Brain tumor, cancer. They gave her 11 months. And I found out this just a few hours ago, and I'm going to preach this tonight. And that's where you go, do we really believe this stuff? And do I really believe that in God's love, He would do something like that? That maybe God loves His child so much, He wants them home before the rest of us. Sovereignty is hard, not mentally. It's hard mentally in some ways, but sovereignty is hard because it forces us to practice what we say we believe. That whatever the Lord pleases, He does, and ultimately, it is right. And that leads me to our third and final hole in our view of God's sovereignty. And I think it's really important. It's that humans tend to think that bad cannot be good. Humans tend to think that bad is incompatible with good. That there can be no good outcome, there can be no good purpose, there can be no good reason, And I am not standing before you as someone who thinks that there are quantifiable, logical reasons to explain pain in life. There's so many pains we'll not know until we can ask Jesus ourselves. But I think Joseph's statement that we all know so well, and we take it as just this nice little button or bow on the story, is such a profound statement of God's sovereignty. You meant it for evil, but God brings about good. That actually in the difficulty of our life, I mean, think about what Joseph had been through. Are you kidding me? Forgotten, forsaken, abused, falsely accused. That God could turn good into something that we perceive to be bad. And when we understand that this is in His sovereign intention, we zoom out and we understand that that is what He's always done, and that is what He continues to do every time a sinner is redeemed. Every time a sinner becomes a worshiper, every time you remember who you were, every time we look at the state of the world and know that this world groans, that this world is messed up, and even the creation groans with eager longing for redemption. Why? Because God, in His sovereign rule, has this powerful and beautiful tendency to take what is terrible and make a glory that only He can. And give you and I, as the redeemed, a front row seat to see it too. So sovereignty is hard because it forces us to exercise what we say we really believe. But sovereignty is hard because in it, at the heart of it, it forces us to be patient. Knowing that God in His sovereign rule, that by His sovereign purposes, has redeemed for Himself a people who were once bad, that by the blood of Christ Jesus, He has made positionally right and good to bring them into His kingdom, not just as subjects to be sovereignly ruled over, but as His children to be loved over and lavished with grace, so that we may one day see with our eyes the King in all His beauty. And what helps us till we get there? The simple yet profound, comforting, confusing, at times gut-wrenching, but soul-securing words. The Lord reigns.